Among nomads, the chiefs command a movable company of kinsmen and servants, with their flocks and herds, and the portable possessions. Here, government will not extend over definite territory, but primarily over definite people, and only incidentally over the territories they may occupy from time to time. In such territories, there may have been previous inhabitants, some of whom may still remain, and strangers may intrude later. But these aliens, even if tolerated or friendly, will form no part of the people ruled by these chiefs according to their special customs and religion. The aliens will be regarded either as collateral peoples with whom there is tacit truce or alliance, or else as guests, prisoners, or slaves, subject indeed to the government, but only as strangers, not having the rights or the duties proper to the dominant people itself. Such is not, however, the fundamental concern of government, indefinitely bounded, settled, in civilized states. Here the chief function of government is the administration of its dominions. It rules primarily over its possessions, which are traditional, complicated, and precious, and its subjects are all the native inhabitants of the territories it controls. Some of these territories, or even all, may have been acquired by conquest or by cession from a previous government, and there may be any degree of diversity among the inhabitants in regard to race, customs, language, and religion. A fairly efficient proprietary government of this kind, such as most of the European monarchies in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, tended to create a political nationality common to their heteroclite populations, but there always remained a cleft and maladoption between the interests of the government and those of the various peoples caught by geographical and historical accidents under its net. Revolutions, successions, ambiguous and reversible alliances were thus made possible and frequent under these landlord governments, who did not represent the spontaneous generative order of society in all, or perhaps in any of their provinces, but rather the domination of some military or doctrinal sect, or of some class of landlords or merchants dominating the government itself. This autocratic idealism in politics is a late militant philosophy, contrary to traditional religions and humane morals. Not that humane morals and traditional religions, if pressed, do not also turn out to be idealistic and sacrificial at bottom, but that they borrow this self-transcendence from nature uncritically and in sympathy with the procreative and poetic essence of animal and sensuous life. Whereas Plato and Hegel were critics respectively of the Sophists and of the French Revolution, and preached a conceptual idealism with a militant, philosophic, and political zeal. The ideal to which they wished to sacrifice natural freedom was not the many-sided ideal irradiation of spontaneous life, but a particular type of society, or a particular method of change, which they chose to impose on mankind, or to attribute mythically to the universe. Their idealisms are therefore heretical from the point of view of traditional religious and of humane morals. In the Old Testament, for instance, the primary object of divine government is the people, an essentially nomadic people without a native land and its native deities, but relying only on a single God of heaven, who came down sometimes to Ararat or to Sinai, and afterwards to his new temple in Jerusalem, but who is worshipped distinctively as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who led his people, Israel, out of Egypt, and promised them a land which in no sense was their native soil. God's covenant was with his people, on condition not of their residence anywhere, but of their spiritual fidelity and legal righteousness. And although the people were conceived collectively as a social and historical unit. The tendency of the prophets, and later of the derivative religions, Christian and Muslim, was to conceive the bond of faith to be personal, in God, rather the God of the heart, the conscience, or the intellect, than the God of any nation. The social bond of orthodoxy might be as tight as you please, but it had nothing to do with a particular territory or a particular lay government. So too, in the case of the British colonists in America, who often liked to identify themselves spiritually with ancient Israel, authority was rooted in persons, not in land, and society was cemented rather by community of manners and interests than by having converged by chance on the same place. House and home were easily transferred. One set of neighbors, being also settlers, would do as well as another. There was land enough for everybody, a whole continent sparsely occupied by natives that could easily be driven away, and the colonists, being at first tolerably homogeneous, and all able and determined to look out for themselves. Government was a simple matter of personal discussion and agreement, especially as a common law for grave quarrels was familiar to all. There was no prior territorial authority. Nobody any longer belonged anywhere in particular. Every interest and every criterion was fresh and private, yet there luckily was, in the crucial places, a similar background, religious and political, behind them all in the old world, from which they also brought their applicable notions of history and the arts, so that they could spontaneously establish a government ruling the people according to the sentiment of fairness and prudence in the people themselves. This absence of local attachments and possessions, combined with a common moral temper and practical competence, has set a special standard and method of procedure for American political action. There is a great confidence in discussion, great expectation of possible agreement, and a great simplicity in nominal purposes, in spite of the fact that the interests to be served and those to be confronted are now grown complex and heterogeneous. Everything seems to Americans to turn on a new organization of enterprise and of education, not on a division of old real estate, but a government that really dominates its territories can gradually and sometimes suddenly transform the inhabitants in language, manners, religion, or even in race. It will not govern the country as Americans expect by governing the people, but will govern the people by governing the country. It is true that this kind of government is often disastrous, and the rulers are themselves destroyed first. But fate overwhelms everything in the end, and territorial domination has secured, for instance, the long prevalence in large areas of Hellenism, of Islam, and of Protestantism. The study of these epidemic systems and their different modes of diffusion and prevalence will be instructive. Hellenism was spread by the conquest of Alexander in the East, where its influence was lasting as that of a fashion in manners and liberal arts, but transitory and only marginal in morals and speculation, whereas through the Roman conquest, Hellenism became the foundation of culture in the West down to our own day. The spread of Islam was essentially militant and aristocratic, establishing government, public works, and civil manners for the conquering race, but leaving the natives, if also men of the book, largely free to live their own way, with their own languages and religions. It was what the British conquest of India might have been if the British monarch and all his people had migrated to India and established themselves there with a mixture of contempt and goodwill towards the Indians. Very different was the imposition of Protestantism in England, Scandinavia, and many parts of Germany. where the princes changed the religion of the people by availing themselves of a religious rebellion in some reformers, and at the same time of great greed and pliability in their own courtiers, in the interests of national pride and royal absoluteness. Here, as in the first establishment of Christianity by Constantine, governments could not so swiftly have changed the people's religion, had not a strong wind of religious change already prevailed. But they revised the new system, which might have developed or evaporated otherwise, if left to itself, by establishing some official church pledged to defend a special orthodoxy. Government is an art, and like other arts, it may be practiced for its own sake, as well as for other objects. Absolute despots are supposed to govern for their own pleasure, but they are often proud of their works and of the prosperity of their dominions. They might also, like Augustus, pride themselves on the literature of their reign. Nor is it necessary that these achievements should be due or attributed to a single monarch. They may be more long-lived than any one man, and a general order and glory in the world may well become the criterion by which both government and people judge the value of their own characters and actions. It was so normally in classic antiquity. The dominant concern of the government was not the private welfare of the inhabitants, however numerous they might become, or whatever habits they might develop. Their number, their education, their privileges were to be made comfortable to the needs of the state for the time being. So too, the privileges and functions of each class or profession. The priests were not to upset this world for the sake of the other. Politicians and sophists were not to demoralize the public for the sake of popularity, nor generals to lead unnecessary expeditions for the sake of fame. The order and glory of the city, for generation after generation, was to be the common object, both of glory and of sacrifice, for all the citizens. The people, the country, or the state may thus be in turn the direct concern of government, but only a perpetually migrating people could fail to acquire roots and possessions in a particular region which would become their country, and be a subject of interest to them in itself for its development, monuments, and physical character. Even an ideal concern for a national state, and in its history, could soon grow up, as in the case, otherwise so different, of Sparta and of the Jews. Nor could any government ignore the material and domestic welfare of the people, or avoid all attachment to the places where they lived and the possessions they might have acquired there. Yet the subordination of one of these objects to another is always possible, and sometimes optional, and the critic of governments needs to understand them all.